Welcome to Marx 613. So in this session, we turn to Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, written and published in February 1848, on the eve of the 1848 revolutions that swept Europe. We read the Communist Manifesto through the lens of Lenin's April theses, delivered 70 years later. And we read both in conversation with another, more recent manifesto, Feminism for the 99%, written by Cinzia Arruzza, Tithi Bhattacharya, and Nancy Fraser. And so for this reason, it's a great privilege and honor to have them with us here this evening at the seminar, all three authors of the manifesto, Feminism for the 99%, to think with us about the original manifesto, how to read it today, how to think about it today, and what it means to be writing a manifesto today. So let me say a few words to situate and contextualize our discussion before properly introducing our three speakers. The Communist Manifesto is a fascinating document to return to today because of how uncomfortably it fits now in Marxist circles and interpretations, and also in our present historical conjuncture. So with all of the writing and research that's now being conducted on the late Marx by scholars like Kohei Saito, who is here with us, welcome as well, whose last book you all know, Slow Down, the Degrowth Manifesto. It's been such an enormous success. And other scholars like Marcello Musto, Bruno Bostiels, who's also here. Thanks, Bruno. Kalja Lidner, and others. With all of those writings on the late Marx, and in this temporal conjuncture of global climate change and the need for degrowth, it's almost as if with the Communist Manifesto, we're kind of at the scene of the crime, right? When I was speaking with Etienne Balibar before the first Marx 113, I remember I pulled out the Engels's volume on Feuerbach. And as I put it on the table, we were having a conversation before the seminar. I put it on the table and he was like, that's the crime. Because it's there that Engels, turned Marx into a rigid historical materialist. But here too, in a way, the Communist Manifesto is the scene of the crime, where Marx and Engels write that the first task of the proletariat, right, once there's the dictatorship of the proletariat, will be, in their words, quote, to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible, right? So the productivism, the problem of productivism, the focus on Western European industrialization is pervasive in the text. And of course, there's also the question of the binarity of the class struggle in the Communist Manifesto, the way in which it's set up, right, in these binary terms from the get-go between the freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a world oppressor and oppressed, in constant opposition, leading, of course, to the opposition between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, which, to a certain extent, will change somewhat, particularly with the 1848 revolution, as we'll see next week, when we read Class Struggles in France, 1848, 1850, with Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. Now, despite those minefields, the Communist Manifesto is such a brilliant historical analysis, an exemplar of how to intervene in a particular historical conjuncture. And so I proposed to read it through Lenin's April theses, because that really allows us to actualize or realize the text, to put it into action, to see how it becomes a form of praxis, to see how the Communist Manifesto interpolates the reader and one of whom, of course, was Lenin. Lenin's April theses were infused with, inspired by the ideas of the manifesto, which permeates the theses, the actions that Lenin would take in the period following the revolution of February 1917. Lenin's entire argument and actions are shaped by the belief that the bourgeois revolution of February 17 was, in the words of Marx and Engels from the manifesto, quote, but the prelude to an immediately following proletarian revolution. It is, in a way, a form of praxis infused by the manifesto that interpolates people. And reading it itself, actually reading the April theses itself, was, for Lenin, a political practice. So pairing both text with the most recent manifesto, Feminism for the 99%, allows us then to actualize both texts and the manifesto form itself. Feminism for the 99% is a compelling manifesto that operates both as a critique of certain strands of Marxism, right? A critique for neglecting social reproduction, the diversity of experiences within the working class, but that also builds on Marx's writings to propose a more comprehensive class struggle, one that includes movements against gender domination, racial capitalism, and LGBTQ oppression, among others. Their manifesto advocates for an internationalist, eco-socialist, anti-racist, and anti-imperialist feminism. And it too grows out of a unique historical conjuncture, which are the international women's movements and strikes throughout the world, particularly back in 2017, 2018. And together, these three texts raise then a set of questions for us. How do we read the Communist Manifesto today? What should we do with it? And how do we deploy the manifesto form today? And again, I couldn't think of a better set of interlocutors to discuss this than Cinzia Arruzza, Tithi Bhattacharya, and Nancy Fraser, who have posed those very questions in their own work and in the postface to a feminism for the 99%. Cinzia Arruzza joins us from Boston University, where she is the Maria Stata Professor of Classical Greek Studies and Professor of Philosophy, and the author of A Wolf in the City, Tyranny and the Tyrant in Plato's Republic. She's currently working on a new book, a new manuscript titled Socrates, Women, Virtue, the Soul, and Sexual Difference in the Socratic Circle and Plato's Dialogues. Tithi Bhattacharya joins us from Purdue, where she is a professor of South Asian history at Purdue University, and the author most recently of Ghostly Past, Capitalist Presence, A Social History of Fear in Colonial Bengal, which was just published with Duke University Press in 2024. She's also the author of The Sentinels of Culture, Class Education, the Colonial Intellectual in Bengal, and the editor of a classic study on social reproduction theory, remapping class, recentering oppression. And Nancy Fraser is, well, Nancy Fraser. She is the Henry E. and Louis Loeb Professor of Philosophy and Politics at the New School for Social Research and a member of the editorial committee of the New Left Review. And her newest book, if I can keep track, is Cannibal Capitalism. Good. How our system is devouring democracy, care, and the planet, and what we can do about it. So I believe that Cinzia, you will kick us off first, and then we'll hear from Nancy, and then from Tithi, and then we'll go into comments and discussions and open it up for questions, of course. So welcome, and let me ask you all to welcome our guests to Marx 613. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this introduction and invitation, Bernard. I'm very glad to be here. I must say, I haven't been at Columbia University for a long while. And I was quite impressed, in the sense, negatively impressed by the level of militarization of the campus. I really rarely seen something like this. And it's a reminder of how scary, like, solidarity for Palestine was for the Columbia administration. Anyway, let's go to the manifesto and the thesis. Although Lenin's thesis of April could be considered a political manifesto of sorts, they're also quite a different document from Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. Contrary to the Communist Manifesto, they do not provide an analysis of capitalism, nor do they articulate the general principles of communism. They are rather a strategic intervention in the context of an unfolding revolutionary situation characterized by dualism of power and a bifurcation of possibility. The bifurcation was between the bourgeois appropriation of the revolution through the provisional government and its further radicalization through the Soviets. Yet at the same time, there is also profound continuity between the thesis and the Communist Manifesto. So to get a better understanding of these differences and similarities, we need to begin from the historical context and the role that these two different documents were meant to play in their historical context. So political manifestos on the model of the Communist Manifesto are documents in which an individual or a group of people present to the public eye an analysis of the present and a view for the future, whether immediate or long-term. More specifically, the most effective political manifestos, in my view, are those that manage to detect a set of historical possibilities contained within a specific conjuncture or within a historical phase, as well as managing to indicate the possible path for their realization. They are therefore predicated on a particular gaze on the present and its history, as they look at the present from the vantage point of the future they aim to realize. So Marx and Engels' present was in many regards dissimilar from Lenin's. It also had a different history. The Communist Manifesto, as mentioned by Bernard, was written on the eve of 1848, of the revolutions of 1848. It was written as the manifesto for a newly founded organization, the Communist League. And while written in a short time, it was also the outcome of a longer attempt at steering theoretically the orientation of the Communist League. So the attempt was to reorient the Communist League away from its religious roots and toward a more historicized account of capitalism and communism. So its immediate goal, the immediate goal of the Communist Manifesto was the reorientation of a specific organization. Yet accomplishing this goal required offering a general view of capitalism and its history, as well as a view of what communism and the role is and the role of the communists in the proletarian movement. So the Communist Manifesto was written and published in a situation of revolutionary ferment, but before the practical experience of the February 1848 revolution and the revolution of June 1848, as well as before the bloody repression of the French proletariat. So the manifesto captures the revolutionary possibilities contained in the present, but also reflects a lack of practical experience and the still undeveloped organizational forms of the working class. So two problems stem from this. First, the manifesto is overly optimistic about the future historical development and the imminent realization of communism. Given the situation in which we are, we can say that it was an excess of optimism. It reads the proletarian revolution as a continuation and completion of the bourgeois revolution, and as necessitated by the very contradictions of capitalist production, These contradictions, according to Marx and Engels in the manifesto, include the impossibility for the bourgeoisie to remain the dominant class for long due to its inability to assure the existence of the people on which it depends, the proletarians. So this prediction didn't prove right. This is the reasoning that Marx and Engels develop in chapter 1, which concludes with the famous claim that the bourgeoisie has created first of all its own grave digger. This may still prove right, but we will have some work to do towards this goal. So this optimism was also predicated on the view that society is going toward an increasing simplification of class antagonism, and that the proletariat is an inherently revolutionary class. Second, so the second problem, Marx and Engels simplify the steps to be taken toward communism in chapter 2 of the manifesto. Lenin's thesis, by contrast, were quickly written down in April 1917, 2 months after the February Revolution, with the goal to reorient the strategy of both Bolsheviks and Mensheviks by identifying the bifurcation of possibilities contained in the present conjuncture, either reaction through the provisional government or permanent revolution throughout Soviet power. They were written in the middle of a revolutionary process within a particular country with its specific conjuncture. Consequently, they are from the beginning to the end a text of political strategy, articulating the main concrete strategic steps that need to be taken immediately in order to intervene in the revolutionary situation. The theses, by the way, are written by Lenin after weeks of letters sent to the Bolshevik party that went largely ignored, where precisely was making the point that they had to resist the attempt of basically co-opting the revolution through the provisional government. So there is a sense of urgency, strategic urgency in the thesis. Furthermore, their take on strategy is informed by the history of past defeated revolutions. The revolutions in 1848, the Paris Commune in 1871, and the Russian Revolution of 1905. So we do not find here the somewhat determinist optimism we can find in the Communist Manifesto. The outcome of the revolution is genuinely open and depends on the nature of the political interventions of the various factions and agents operating within the conjuncture, and on which we will ultimately prevail. Despite these differences, there are elements of continuity between the Communist Manifesto and the thesis, as I mentioned earlier. And in a sense, we could consider the thesis as, in a sense, a rewriting or a completion of the Communist Manifesto. And this is a theme to which I will go back later. Now, to show why this is the case, I will refer to 2 prefaces that Marx and Engels wrote to later editions of the manifesto. One is the preface to the edition of 1872, and then the preface to the first Russian translation written in 1882, sorry. Now, 1872 offered a profoundly different historical context. Marx and Engels had witnessed both the defeat of 1848 and of the Paris Commune. And they have now experienced the political complexities of revolutionary struggles, and also like the complexities of organizing the proletariat through the First International, for example. Consequently, in the 1872 preface, they write that the Paris Commune had demonstrated that it is not possible to simply take on the bourgeois state to use it at the service of communist goals. On the contrary, it is necessary to replace it with a new form of state. And this is a big correction to what written in chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto. Furthermore, they write that the revolutionary measures proposed in the second chapter of the manifesto are outdated and inapplicable. For practical experience has shown that the application of the general principles of the Communist Manifesto depends on the particular national conjuncture in which one operates, so it cannot be predicted in abstract forms. In the 1882 preface to the Russian translation, they write that the Russian Revolution could become the signal of the proletarian revolution in the West, so that they may complement each other. In this case, they write, the traditional Russian communal land property, the община, could serve as the direct starting point for a communist development. So to go back to the thesis, Lenin clearly indicates in the thesis that the first goal is to give all power to the Soviets and to constitute a new form of state based on them. Reverting to parliamentary democracy would be a regression of the revolutionary process. While he takes up some of the ideas proposed by the Communist Manifesto for the transition to communism, so for example, the creation of a national bank, he inserts them within a conjuncture-based strategy. So from this viewpoint, we could consider the thesis as the concrete application of some of the general principles of the Communist Manifesto within a particular situation. Finally, the push toward a permanent revolution and the transformation of the bourgeois February Revolution into a socialist one is in line with Marx and Engels' point that Russia does not need to wait for the full development of capitalism and parliamentary democracy in the country, but can serve as the signal for the proletarian revolution in the West. And this is precisely Lenin's strategy in the thesis, taken by the way from Trotsky, and will be the key strategic idea of the October Revolution. It is moreover a strategy guided by a strong commitment not only to internationalism, but to the idea that a successful revolution toward communism can only be international, such as we find in the Communist Manifesto as well. So as I mentioned earlier, given these aspects, we could consider Lenin's thesis as a creative rewriting of the manifesto. And this leads me to address a more general question, that is, what kind of text should we consider the Communist Manifesto to be today? Should we consider it as a historical document or as a template to be followed? Now, I tend to agree with Etienne Balibar that the answer to this question is neither. As Balibar argued, the Communist Manifesto cannot be taken as a template, but it's also not an inert historical document. It is rather a text that asks to be continuously rewritten, updated, and corrected in the form of new manifestos which respond to the new different conjunctures. So in the conclusion of these brief remarks, let me spend a few words on another way more modest manifesto, especially modest in its historical impact and historical goals. So which is Feminist for the 99%. I take it that the Feminist for the 99% too can take its place in the history of creative rewritings of the Communist Manifesto. As both texts we have discussed, so the manifesto and Lenin's thesis, Feminist for the 99% also identifies political possibilities for the future in the contradictions of the present. As the analysis of both capitalism and communism in the manifesto lacked a discussion of social reproduction and of women as a collective actor, Feminist for the 99% offers both. It explains what social reproduction is and why its crisis opens up possibilities for struggle. Most importantly, it responds to a specific conjuncture created by the feminist strike movements around the globe and identifies in these movements a crucial political actor. Furthermore, it emphasizes the centrality of internationalism and of unity of struggles. Unlike the thesis, however, it does not articulate any specific strategy. It remains at the level of the enunciation of principles and general guidelines. This is because in writing it, I think we took seriously Marx and Engels' point from 1872. So the application of the principles enunciated cannot be predicted in an abstract way. It has to emerge from the specific dynamics of each struggle. In this case, it was the task of the various feminist strike movements to devise their own strategy, as well as possibly a collective common international strategy. finally, like the Communist Manifesto, Feminine for the 99%, two are ways to be rewritten and updated. That is, it is not meant, and it was not meant as a static document, but as an active, ongoing attempt to identify potentialities in the present for a better, more just future, or at least so we hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Cinzia, and for raising those questions, which we'll clearly address in the conversation about rewriting manifestos and how to deal with that in the present. Nancy, is yours on? Yes? Okay. Is it on? Yeah.
It's not in. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, thanks so much, Bernard, for organizing this. And it's great to, is that right?
Yep.
It's great to be reunited with my two friends here, whom I don't think we've been together for probably
Many years.
a long time, yeah, all three of us. And so it's really good. I feel like we're resuming our collaboration. Yeah, so I want to zero in on two of Cinzia's points, which shows how sort of deep our collaboration was, because they were among the 2 points that I was most determined to make even before I read your notes. And I want to try to elaborate these points in thinking about the relationship between our manifesto, which I for shorthand call F99, with the Communist Manifesto, CM. Okay, so the first point that I want to take from Cinzia has to do with this question of conjuncture. Now, you heard her say that a political manifesto is most effective when it intervenes self-consciously in a definite, historically specific conjuncture, when it succeeds in identifying the emancipatory possibilities that are imminent in that conjuncture, and when it is able to suggest a plausible path, not a guaranteed path, but a plausible path to their realization. She characterized, I like the word that you used, the kind of gaze that the manifesto writer trains on his or their time. The writers of manifestos look, I'm just quoting Cinzia again, they look at the present and at its history, so the present past is already in play here, with an eye to the future that they hope to realize. So we've got a real temporal synthesis going on here. Cinzia also notes that both, however different they are, I think that it's fair to say, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you said, but I think it's fair to say that both the Communist Manifesto and Lenin's theses identify in their respective conjunctures a bifurcation of possibilities. This picks up on Bernard's introductory comment about bifurcation, which you introduced with a somewhat skeptical and critical note. And I want to flag that, because what I hope we can think about here is the difference between a bifurcation that is simply assumed to be there and one that is constructed politically in this, let's say, Gramscian Schmittian sense, so to speak. And I'm not sure that that these are always clearly distinguished in these texts, but it's important for us to think about that distinction. Anyway, the bifurcation of possibilities, some emancipatory, some quite the opposite. And you see this both in the Communist Manifesto and in Lenin. And both those texts at the same time try to chart a possible path to emancipation. It's true that there's a distinction between how concrete and how contextualized and so on. But this seems to me to be shared, and I think this applies as well to feminism for the 99%, to F99. And even I discovered, just by thinking about it, which I hadn't realized before, even the way we organize our 11 theses reflects something like this. I'll come back to that in a second. But first, let me tell you the second point I want to flag here. And that concerns the so-called weak points that Cinzia pointed out about the Communist Manifesto, points that were later recognized by Marx and Engels themselves, at least some of them anyway, and have been by many of their successors. The Communist Manifesto, Cinzia says, is overly optimistic. It anticipates a fairly imminent proletarian revolution and the realization of communism. It assumes, I'm really channeling you here, that proletarian revolution is necessitated, that's a very important word, by the contradictions of capitalist production, that the system logic is producing its own gravediggers, that society is moving toward this bifurcation. It's less a created bifurcation than one that is just sort of happening necessarily through leading to this simplification of class antagonism, that, you know, pretty soon there will be nothing but the two great classes, right, facing each other. Continue with Cinzia, the Communist Manifesto underestimates the political complexities of revolutionary struggles. And this point, I think, is one that we were very keen on addressing in our manifesto. But, and I'm a little hesitant about how to put this, because the three of us may not fully agree on everything I'm going to say, which will make things interesting if we don't. So take what I'm about to say as my shtick here, okay? We want to address that problem of to not underestimate political complexity, but not in the quote unquote usual way. That is, not by simply jettisoning determinism in favor of contingency, nor by, and I'm coming back to Lenin here, or at least to Gramsci's characterization of Lenin, by the politics of the will. You just, you know, make it happen. Rather, at least my idea in our manifesto was that we were reconceptualizing capitalism itself as an internally differentiated social totality, which gives rise in a way that is not contingent or fully accidental, but, right, emanates from the nature of the totality. It gives rise for non-accidental reasons to an internally differentiated working class, and thus to a host of greater difficulties when it comes to making a political, an emancipatory political agent out of a class that is deeply riven now. And of course, you all remember the passages in the Communist Manifesto, which have to do that how, you know, the proletariat has no country, everything is solid, melts in the air. There's this inexorable logic. It's that simplification of the antagonism again, the naturally evolving bifurcation, that all of the things that we know today internally differentiate the working class and divide it in an internally antagonistic way, we're supposed to just disappear, okay? So we, taking into account the sort of, with the benefit of hindsight, the failure of that prediction, if it is a prediction, we were offering a rather different account first of the structural dynamics of capitalist society as producing differentiation rather than homogenization. And secondly, necessarily a different account of the relation between those structural dynamics and the political developments that respond to them. So that we can't use that necessitate word in the same way anymore. I think those are 2 points that capture some of the issues that I'm very interested in revisiting the manifesto. Now, let me just go into a little bit more detail. First of all, on this question of conjuncture, it's very striking that we wrote this manifesto in the relatively immediate aftermath of Donald Trump's election victory in 2016. And here we sit again, okay, in the aftermath. And yet the mood, the zeitgeist could not be more different. As Cinzia noted, we tried to sort of hitch ourselves, if you like, to a actually developing emancipatory potentiality in the present. And I think we will have to say that they'll use the same word, overestimated the historical weight and importance of the International Feminist Women's Strike. But it is interesting that we needed to not be writing as sort of armchair speculators and analysts, but to see ourselves as we didn't have an organization, but there was something. The theses themselves, the difference in the mood is the diagnosis. That's thesis number one. A new feminist wave is reinventing the strike. We're going to ride the wave and tell you where it should go. Thesis two, liberal feminism is bankrupt. It's time to get over it. Hillary Clinton. Dare I say, Kamala Harris. Now, let's see the value. So this is the bifurcation. There's the bad feminism and the good feminism. And it's not that this was, what is the rhetorical word, prolepsis? We're trying to make it happen. We're not saying that it's exactly really like this yet, but we are, we're okay. So I would say, if I could just get a little partisan here, how many times does the Democratic Party have to do the same stupid thing over and over and over again? Okay, the diagnosis of that underlay our thing is right, even if we overestimate it. That diagnosis, liberal feminism is bankrupt, and not just liberal feminism, liberal environmentalism, liberal anti-racism, liberal LGBTQ, et cetera, et cetera. Progressive neoliberalism, as we called it, and I had called it, is dead. Okay. Is it a revolutionary situation? No. It's an interregnum in Gramsci's sense, where the ruling parties and mindsets have lost their credibility. So the previous hegemony is in tatters, but there is no credible and robust counter-hegemony in evidence. So that's a different kind of diagnosis than a dual power situation. But I think that's the situation that we're in. And it's harder now to see, to find the wave to hitch yourself to. That doesn't mean it won't come at some point, but that's where we are. Okay. Third thesis, we need an anti-capitalist feminism, a feminism. So I think the master word in the whole manifesto is this anti-capitalist word. it's what links the analyses of every topic in the following list. From gender to race to violence to colonialism, ecological devastation, militarism, war, and so on. So here's a bifurcation attempt. On the one hand, there are pro-capitalist feminisms. They may not think of themselves in those terms or call themselves that, but here's another kind. That's the liberal feminism versus the strike wave. Thesis 4, we're living through a crisis of society as a whole. It's not a sectoral crisis. It's not just economic. It's not just a crisis of work or just a crisis of politics, but all of these things exacerbating each other. And I can't resist a temptation to say that when we say it's a general crisis, this is not what Adam Tooze means by a polycrisis. His polycrisis does have all of these different dimensions, but for him, this is just contingent. They're not rooted in any single social totality. And to call it anti-capitalist is to name the social totality that is the problem. Okay. So without belaboring the point and using up time, each of the following theses on gender oppression, as Shinzi already noted, has to do with the capitalism signature division between social reproduction and commodity production in for-profit enterprises, which is a gendered distinction. We look at a thesis on violence. Capitalism tries to organize sexuality. We want to liberate it. Capitalism was, the word here in every one of these things is capitalism. Please note that. Capitalism was born from racist and colonial violence. We want a feminism that's anti-racist, anti-imperialist. Capitalism destroys the earth. We are eco-socialist. And then finally, so this is the analytic, is to say that all of these things have some kind of an important relation to capitalism that is not accidental. And therefore, when we get to thesis 11, we call on all radical movements to join together in a common anti-capitalist insurgency. This is the thing that can connect. Because however differently people are situated, however differently they rank the most pressing problem for them in the immediate sense, however differently they choose to focus their energies for political struggle, in the end, there's something that connects them. And so we always hoped that there would emerge an environmentalism for the 99%, an anti-racism for the 99%, right, et cetera, that we had that idea that, you know, that of course, it's populist language, it's not a class analysis, but 99% meant the working class. Try to construct the working class as a political agent. And what I would go on to say, though, and I want to be, I think I'm taking too long, so I'll try to go very quickly. It's okay. Okay. So this whole question of, I think this really brings us to the hardest question, and that is, what is the relationship between arguing, as we do, that there is a kind of a system logic or an institutional structure in capitalist societies that does divide the working class internally, as well as from the capitalist class and from all sorts of intermediate formations. What is the relationship between that and political thinking and political struggle and political organization? You could also say, what is the relationship between a system crisis and a political crisis or a crisis of hegemony. We have both. I think it's very clear, as Bernard said at the outset, that we have a very deep system crisis right now in this general sense that includes a crisis of social reproduction, of ecology, of democracy and political order, and so on. But what is the relation between that and the ways in which people respond to it and organize themselves, develop political identities that they want to march or fight under? And this idea in the Communist Manifesto, which is not at all the case, by the way, in many other writings by Marx. So we should resist the idea to just, think of Marx and Engels, for that matter, as just straight, simple-minded, determinists. But this idea that that they assumed that the logic of the system was to the sharpening, to the homogenization of the working class, and therefore the almost automatic binarism of the two classes. That certainly is in the Communist Manifesto. I think, though, that it's partly rhetorical, and this is, again, a response to Bernard. Again, as an agitational document meant to mobilize, it's trying to create the bifurcation as much as simply representing. Now, it's ambiguous, I would grant you, because it does think that there's an underlying basis for the bifurcation. But it doesn't assume that it's already there. That's for sure, because as Chinsey says, we're writing in 1848, so it's certainly not there. Okay. Now, basically what I think we do is, and it's clearest in the thesis on social reproduction, is try to say that capitalism has a gender division of labor built into it. It divides one kind of work from another kind that is equally necessary. It subordinates one kind to the other kind. And as long as we continue to think of the working class as, guys in factories, we're going to miss a huge part of who performs the socially necessary labor that keeps the whole thing afloat. I think also, and again, I'm not sure what my two co-authors will say to this, but I think also in the discussion of race and empire, there is this kind of Du Boisian point about doubly free labor versus enslaved or dependent or bonded or coerced labor, which, as we all know, certainly did not end with the abolition of New World slavery. So there's another kind of capitalism is relying, accumulation of capital is relying on both, like, as Du Bois thought, two pistons of one engine, right? Mississippi and Manchester, joined at the hip, divided by the chasm of race. So this is another point of that there's something in the differentiation of the social totality. This is not false consciousness. Okay. Only. Okay. So I think that some of what we're doing in this document is trying to convey a different idea of internal divisions among the working class and that complicate the socialist project or the communist project. Let's see, all that is solid has not melted in the air, clearly, and for reasons that I think we're just starting to, maybe not just starting, some of us understood a long time ago, but many of us are starting to understand better now. And in developing a more complex account of capitalism as an internally differentiated social totality, we are in a position to better clarify the complexities of political class struggle. We, yeah, of course, I think we were much more optimistic when we wrote this. I was, at least. As Cinzia said, even, walking around this campus is enough to really bum you out. And this is not the only such campus, of course. Okay, is there a problem with the?
No, just make sure.
Yeah, I think I think I've said everything that I needed to say. I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. And so I think when my turn comes, I think I will want to ask some questions about these questions of picking up on the divisions and in relationship to the concept of the 99%, maybe. But okay, we'll come back to that because next we're going to hear from Dithi Bhattacharya. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. Okay.
Oh, no, it's not the. It's like
It's on.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bernard, for inviting us here, giving us a chance to meet up with old friends. And thank you, Ricardo, for doing all the work and making us very comfortable. I want to start by saying that I acknowledge that there was a genocide for 141 days and that we are finally looking towards some kind of rebuilding of Gaza, hopefully. And this is precisely why speaking about empire in a overtly militarized campus is a real pleasure, and to think with my friends and colleagues here is a real privilege. So you can see how we chose to write this document together, because what I am going to say, without having read or heard either of them before, is going to be very, very similar to what my previous speakers have said. So the Communist Manifesto, first published in 1848 and famously revised in 1871 in the wake of the Paris Commune, enclosed within it traces of the uprisings that birthed it. It is a document whose theories arise from and are amended by social movements. Importantly, it is written for the ordinary worker who, as Engels commented in its 1888 English preface, acknowledged it, the common worker that is, acknowledged the manifesto as their, I quote, common platform from Siberia to California, unquote. So you can see the optimism there. It is in this specific sense of a document arising from a movement that we chose to call our work, our own work, a manifesto. For although in a less grand scale, our manifesto too arose from the wave of feminist strikes and both contributed to those strikes and were recalibrated by them. In this brief reflection, I hope to draw out some of the ways in which our manifesto stands in the tradition of Marxist theorizing of capitalism, and in one key respect, makes a contribution to it. So is the Communist Manifesto about the capitalist economy? A significant feminist criticism aimed at the manifesto is that it focuses on economic production at the expense of social reproduction and consumption. Feminists such as Alison Jagger, Heidi Hartman, and this is way back in the 1980s and 1990s, have made a strong case about this neglect on Marx and Engels' part, going as far as to say that they have defined, quote, even the non-procreative part of women's household work, not only as being outside the market, but as being outside production altogether, unquote. This is Jagger. The charge of economism is important because it extends beyond feminist theorists and is actually significantly widespread. It is also, I would argue, significantly misplaced. Marx's subject matter, as also Nancy and Cinzia have pointed out, is capitalism, including but not limited to its historical origins, its philosophical underpinnings, its political expressions, and the roots of social power over human beings and nature, its roots of social power. In his Paris manuscripts, for instance, Marx takes up cudgels against those he calls, quote, crude communists, who believe that replacing private property with collective ownership was sufficient to establish a communist society. In sharp contrast, Marx shows crude communism to be an abstract negation of the entire world of culture and civilization. Here, the alienated form of labor, and I quote Marx here, is not done away with, but extended to all men. Instead of private capitalists, all it does is creates a society in which, I quote him again, the community is the universal capitalist, unquote. Significantly, for our purposes, in such a society, claims Marx, I quote, a woman becomes a piece of communal and common property, unquote. One cannot then, according to Marx, substitute this or that aspect of capitalism. It has to be overhauled as a system. The law of value, which guides capitalist world-making, must be abolished. Thus, Marx criticizes Proudhon, who sought to replace money with time chits, which would express the real value of commodities. Following Ricardo, a different one, not the one who helped us, Proudhon believed that since the value of a commodity represented the value of labor that produces it, time chits representing the value would eliminate parasites and middlemen like bankers and bosses, and be the true representation of workers' labor. To this proposition, Marx writes, quote, wages as demanded by Proudhon only transforms the relationship of a worker to his labor into the relationship of all men to labor. Okay, again, that same proposition. Unless you abolish the law of value, you cannot change capitalism as a whole. Society is then conceived of, according to this proposal by Proudhon, as an abstract capitalist. In other words, without abolishing the division of labor in production, without abolishing the basis of capitalism, the value form, any attempt to alter capitalism is precisely that, a tinkering with the system, not the conditions of emancipation. Later, in the Grundrisse, Marx consolidates his polemic against this tendency, calling it an idealized vision of capitalism without capitalists. These analytical moves by Marx, as well as his explicit reference to capitalism as, quote, the entire world of culture and civilization, unquote, should make it clear that Marx has not an economic, but a civilizational critique of capitalism. And consequently, Marx's theory, unlike its bourgeois counterparts, categorically refuses, in Ellen Wood's classic phrase, the separation of the economic and the political. Instead, as Wood puts it rather elegantly, Marx's theory, I quote, is uniquely capable of illuminating the principles of historical movement and at least implicitly the points at which political action can most effectively intervene, unquote. We can then distill two critical ideas from this discussion. First, that Marx's theory is primarily concerned with explaining the world in order to change it. And this is, everybody knows that. In other words, then, it is a movement theory. Marxism is a movement theory. And second, that being a theory of capitalism as a civilization, it contains within it, either in developed or underdeveloped form, the analytical resources for understanding the fundamental metabolic relationship between human society as a whole and nature, or the natural world. It is thus absurd to claim that Marxism as a framework is incapable of explaining this phenomena or that phenomena, such as gender or imperialism or racism or climate change. We extend Marx, we develop Marx, we pull and push at Marx, but we always return to his insistent call to arms to uproot the system as a whole. And with this context in mind, and it is this kind of understanding of Marx and Marxism that some of us in the feminist movement are still in the process of excavating Marxism to develop further social reproduction theory, or SRT, which forms one of the key theoretical bases of our manifesto. So Marx gender and social reproduction theory, or SRT. If we begin with the feminist critique of Marxism as an inadequate theory of the processes of consumption, we will have to agree only partially. It is true that Marx does not develop a theory of gender as such, nor does he pay sufficient attention, he pays some, to how gendering smooths the workings of the system. Nevertheless, we can scavenge from Marx's writings enough material to build our own Marxist extensions, like Google extensions, to understand gender under capitalism. So let us consider his reflections on the relationship between production and consumption in volume 1 of Capital. So I'm not going to read the quote, but paraphrase for you. He says that the worker's consumption is of two kinds. One is productive consumption, where he consumes or she consumes the means of production and produces the commodity, and in another form is individual consumption, where they consume subsistence materials in order to reproduce themselves for the next day. So we have productive consumption and individual consumption, and these are separate under capitalism. They're not really separate, but they appear to be separate under capitalism. And here I will quote Marx because it's a lovely phrase. He says, the result of the first kind of consumption, which is productive consumption, is that capitalist continues to live. Of the second, the worker himself continues to live. So we're talking about a push and pull between productive consumption and individual consumption. So the more the worker pulls away from productive consumption and asks for time and resources for themselves, the more the capitalist pulls away and extends either the workday or introduces machinery, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the general argument of volume 1. So this capitalist social relations then contain, albeit in concealed form, the production and reproduction of capitalism's most, and I quote Marx here, indispensable means of production, which is the worker. This insight provides the scaffolding for social reproduction theory, which concerns itself with life-making in capitalist societies. It proposes that capital's process of accumulation depends upon the daily and generational reproductive work that working class people do. Some of it performed outside the immediate circuits of commodity production to ensure that a steady flow of labor power is always made available for capitalists to exploit. The two moments, productive consumption at the point of production and individual consumption away from it, are not in mutual opposition, but two dialectical moments of the circuit. Social reproduction of labor power, therefore, also conceals this systemic contradiction. So social reproduction as a whole also has this duality. Labor power is reproduced both, as Marx points out, under the regulation of capital, as well as it is reproduced to satisfy and speak to genuine human needs and affects. We raise children, for instance, with love and care, but we also teach them to be safe, productive citizens of capitalist society. For example, I had to teach my then 4-year-old that even when she's hungry, she cannot just take a chocolate bar from Target to eat in the car. So this is a lesson, and this is a social reproduction of her labor power that I undertake even as a Marxist mama, because I have to teach her how to be in the world. Her teachers do the same. They teach her astonishing Miriam Kabe books, but they also tell her, you need to not swear at the policeman. So if the reproduction of labor power, whose normative goal in capitalism is the reproduction of the wage relation, and this is the primary concern of SRT, then it is impossible to claim that any real understanding of the capitalist family or gendering can be achieved without placing those institutions and social relations squarely within the systemic workings of capitalism. And this is why we write in our manifesto, and I quote, "In capitalist society, the organization of social reproduction rests on gender. It relies on gender roles and entrenches gender oppression. Social reproduction is therefore a feminist issue, but it is shot through at every point by the fault lines of class, race, sexuality, and nation. A feminism aimed at resolving the current crisis must understand social reproduction through a lens that also comprehends and connects all those axes of domination, unquote. However, I will point, so this is the good part, that we understand social reproduction. Here's the other side. Where do you think in the Americas were first developed childcare centers or little creches? Where do you think they first developed in the Americas? On plantations. Okay, that is social reproduction, that is care work that the planter needed to ensure was happening such that he had actual babies to sell or to put to work within his cotton fields. So again, social reproduction is not this sort of, valued understanding. Well, I'm not going to use the word value. It's too confusing. Social reproduction is not this angelic, view of care work. It tries to understand the historical role of the reproduction of labor power within capitalism. And because it happens within capitalism, it is of this dual nature. In conclusion, I would like to bring our attention back to how Marx's critique of capitalism goes beyond the phenomenal level. His alternative to the system is thus also not restricted to surface phenomena or correcting wrongs and injustices that are produced through and constitutive of this system. He is interested in replacing the system. So here I will end with a provocation. I propose that only through social reproduction we can have a partial vision of futurity for the human subject. It is true that systemic alienation and the wage form produces the worker as an object, but they are neither born as an object nor in reality one. So Peter Hudis, for instance, has argued that if human subjectivity was fully absorbed by the object, then Marx's capital would be a totalizing system out of which we could never escape. And the historical character of capitalism would have to be denied. Labor, of course, is accorded the value form under capitalism, but it is not as such the source of value. Even though they do not contravene the law of values, decommodified social reproduction relationships in our here and now, love between individuals, caring for our beloveds, commoning, collective decision-making bodies in resistant political spaces can all be treated as prefigurative templates of the future, making social reproduction theory not merely a tool for explaining the world, but a partial manifesto for changing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Diti, for that. Now, and I that's presented as a provocation, but it seems it seems right. I mean, so it's not provoking a negative reaction. Let's put it that way. This idea then that forms of care, existing forms of care within capitalist society today can serve as prefigurative, perhaps, of some of the relations that might guide a post-capitalist future. Seems right. I suppose it's, in a way, actually, Lenin in 1923 comes back to questions of cooperation in his essays on cooperation. And there's almost a way in which there you can see him suggesting maybe the same thing. Now, it's not, it's slightly, it's not social reproduction theory. It's more forms of cooperation, which could be analogized to forms of care. But he comes back to it there specifically to say, well, maybe actually there is something there, and one could read that as also prefiguring what to expect or hope for in post-capitalist society. So thank you. I just want to maybe I'd like to start a first round of and get all three of you to kind of speak to each other for a minute before opening it up to questions. And take Cynthia, your idea of rewriting, updating, and correcting, which I think is right, and which was, I think, what you were doing in this work, trying to seize a particular historical conjuncture and to rethink. And then to rethink it through, Nancy, what you were talking about, which was this claim that capitalism produces differentiation rather than homogenization, and how so much of the work that you were doing in your manifesto is about trying to understand those forms of differentiation and in a way get beyond them, right? And I think that the getting beyond them is central to the project of feminism for the 99%. Because the notion of the 99% is, of course, so the notion of the 99% is something that I've favored back in, 2011 strongly. So this isn't intended to be kind of a critique of the notion of the 99%. But the notion of the 99% has a certain amount of homogeneity to it, I take it, right? And it's that homogeneity, or that, yeah, it's trying to elide, in a way, the fractures and conflicts within the 99%. And I hear that in your manifesto on page 54, where you say feminism for the 99% must join forces with other anti-capitalist movements across the globe, with environmentalist, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, LGBTQ plus movements and labor unions. We must ally above all with left-wing anti-capitalist currents of those movements that all champion the 99%. And so, I don't know, maybe it's my time to rethink the notion of the 99%, particularly the week of this inauguration. And so what I'm wondering, I think, and so here's my provocation, maybe. In some sense, maybe, and this is a provocation both to a Marx and Engels Communist Manifesto notion of class struggle, but also to a kind of feminism for the 99% theory of allies within the 99%. Maybe the problem actually is not class struggle. But the desires of people in these different classes, if we say 99% of the 1%, to dominate or not to dominate. And so this is an idea that I was starting to develop a little bit in the introduction that I was trying to draft for this session. But in other words, it's not as if maybe it's not feeling right now as if it's the 99% against the 1%, because we would have had a different vote count if that had been the case, right? It's feeling more as if within the 99%, there are many people within all of these fractured divisions and differentiated 99% who maybe want a world where there is capitalist domination, even if they are suffering from it themselves, who desire or who aspire to be part of the 1%, just as there are people in the 1% or, tenured faculty members who are well paid, who want kind of forms of solidarity that would eschew domination and inequality. And so the question then becomes, how do we think about, the question becomes, how do we think about that division, which is so central, I think, to your manifesto, the opposition between this group that views itself as kind of a left-wing anti-capitalist currents championing the 99% and the 1%. Let's start there maybe, and then I can get you to think about that and go through a round of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So very briefly, so first of all, I think we need to distinguish between the 99% as a descriptive category and as a political one. So, like during Occupy, like a few thousand people in Zuccotti Park were chanting, "We are the 99%. Obviously, they were not. There were a few thousand people in Zuccotti Park. But what the 99% slogan gestured to was the possibility of a, let's say, of a process of universal solidarity in the struggle. Or at least this is the way I think we interpreted the issue also in our manifesto. So in other words, it's the 99% doesn't necessarily indicate homogeneity. It indicates the necessity of a unity of struggles. And this, as I mentioned earlier in my remarks, is something that we actually do share with the Communist Manifesto and also with the Lenin's thesis, because Lenin's strategic point is that you need the alliance between the industrial workers and the poor peasants, for example, in order to accomplish what he's suggesting should be accomplished. So you need alliances, you need unity of struggles. So from this viewpoint, I think when you say like many in the 99% want capitalism, yeah, we are aware in the sense of, look at in what situation we are. So I agree. But that's not the point. So we do not think that the large majority of the oppressed and dominated is inherently revolutionary or inherently is the beer revolutionary or emancipatory project. We want them to be. So in other words, it's a political construct. So we indicate the political possibility of having the large majority of the oppressed and the dominated and the exploited unite together in an emancipatory process. So this I would suggest is the way of reading what the 99% in our title is.
Okay, great. I might come back to you and ask you how we do that. in a minute, but
Who knows?
Nancy.
Okay. Yeah, so, I mean, just to stick to that question, you raised some other really interesting questions also that I hope we'll get to, but just to stick with the 99% question. Speaking for myself, and this is not in the manifesto, I would say that basically we were taking on board left populist language. This is not Marxian class analysis for sure. But as Cinzia said, it had a lot of resonance and it has a lot of mobilizing potential. So it's not just that a few thousand people in Zuccotti said that when they weren't, it's that within 3 weeks, 70% of Americans said they agreed with them in polls, which is really astounding. So I think, again, this is something that we thought we could sort of play with and use. Now, for me anyway, the idea was, again, this is not in the manifesto, can left populism be a transition stage to democratic socialism or communism? Because, you know, you got to start somewhere, let's say. And I got a lot of flack, I have to say, when I talked about this in some interviews. Oh, you're turning into Chantal Mouffe and so on. But what I want to say about it is that I think that it's very important to understand that there are very significant, important differences between left populism and right populism, which for me, populism is not a dirty word as it is for liberals. It's the kind of, you know, some sort of a starting point. And the 99% is against the 1%. Right-wing populism is against the bloodsuckers at the top and the underclass that's destroying us from the bottom. That's a 3-part social map as opposed to a 2-part. That's left populism is a lot better, okay? Number one. Number two, right-wing populism concretizes its opponent in cultural and you know, sometimes even biological terms, in terms of race. It's Jewish bankers or, you know, Mexican rapists or whatever. The 1% as a term, and it's true, it was called Occupy Wall Street, but it's more functional. Well, actually, Wall Street is better than just a number because it indicates something about the role of finance. I appreciate that it can easily slide when you use that into Jewish banker, and you have to work politically to make sure it doesn't. But so for me, populist language at the time is within a kind of leftish twist was something I'm willing to sort of work with. I know that that's not universally agreed to, but I think there's plenty of class analysis in the manifesto also that is kind of giving it, you know, some more, you know, real content. The other thing I would say about about people who want to be in the 1%, well, of course, who wouldn't? I mean, I mean, I want to make 2 points about that. I think that's not the problem. The real problem is people who are fed up and just want something different and don't have access to any, you know, actually emancipatory conception of what something different and better would be, and who are therefore just, you know, sitting ducks for they're eating our cats and dogs kind of talk, right? So it's the people who are actually recognize the severity of the crisis, have a wrong diagnosis of what causes it and who the enemy is and so on. And that should be for, let's assume that people here are, you know, people like us, assuming we're all in this boat, those are people we have to try to woo. Some of them are irredeemable, granted, but if they all are, then we should just pack up and go home. So the people who are angry, they know something, however distortedly. The other thing, what was the other thing? Yeah, the other problem with 1% is this problem of the professional managerial strata and all these intermediate classes, because, you know, the 1%, that's only 1%, but there's another 20%, let's say, who in Gramscian terms, you know, are maintaining all the ditches and fortresses and the opinion, the ideological apparatuses and the chattering classes. That includes all of us, let's face it. So, you know, and I think that, as I think Marxists always have, assume that a significant chunk of that class can be won to the side of the working class in a, you know, intelligently. Anyway, that's what I assume. So, you know, the language is definitely fuzzy. The numbers are not right, but whatever.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Nancy. No, that's really helpful, actually, because before turning to the sorry,
That's fine.
I can imagine rewriting. I mean, so we're talking about rewriting manifestos. I can imagine a different version of this manifesto that actually doesn't necessarily use the 99% language and is written in much more of a kind of classically Marxist class conflict language, class, race, gender, conflict language. So that's very interesting and helpful as we think through this and the relationship between left populism and Marxism here. Okay, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Thanks. So I have possibly 4 things to say. The first is about the 99%, which is, I completely agree, is a mobilizing category. It is not a literal category. It's a political mobilization category. Think about the Bolsheviks. Their slogan, since we're talking about the April thesis, their slogan for 1917 was bread, peace, and land. Now, bread, peace, maybe bread, but peace and land are definitely not, in that sense, anti-capitalist, right? So the bread, peace, and land by the Bolsheviks is a political category which mobilizes at the time the most advanced section of the proletariat as well as the peasantry. So that's why that particular slogan worked very well to embed the ideas and the project of Bolshevism in the class it was intended for. So the 99% would not have been useful if only those 2,000 people in New York used it. But 99% as a mobilizing tool, as a shorthand, as an analogy, was actually had become global. So you could go to New Delhi and say 99%, and everyone would know which end of the political spectrum you came from. So that's the first thing. The second is about this question of the horrors of the present. And I am not one who believes that the present is not horrifying. However, we also forget, perhaps, that Marx and Engels were dealing. So to me, and I'm not saying this because Kohei is here, But to me, the greatest horror of our times is not Donald Trump, it is the ecological crisis, because it is a planetary horror that we are facing in terms of the future of the planet, as well as the future of the living beings on this planet. So I see that as the greatest horror of our time. And Donald Trump is sort of part of that horror in exacerbating it, but the greatest horror, I believe, is the climate crisis. Similarly, in Marx's time, we forget this, but what was the greatest horror? It was slavery. So, you know, Marx knew very well what a differentiated, internally differentiated class looks like, because half of that class was in manacles and chains. And this is why it is a very clear passage in Capital Volume 1, which says that the system comes dripping in blood and of colonialism and slavery, right? So that, I think, we have to understand a little bit about what Marx and Engels are, the times that they're writing in. And slavery, I believe, is a much greater horror than Donald Trump. So, where do we see the internally differentiated class? So that is constitutive of the process of accumulation. And how do I see social reproduction theory helping there is the standard Marxist explanation for class differentiation is that the differentiation takes place within the labor market, right? It's through competition that the working class is differentiated. I argue in SRT that actually the differentiation happens before the worker reaches the labor market, right? So I believe that particularly certain neighborhoods in the south side of Chicago is socially reproduced in such a way that there are no working schools, that the hospitals are closed, and the neighborhood is full of concrete, no greenery or access to public park. And that creates a socially reproduced neighborhood even before the children of that neighborhood reach schools or the workplace, right? The children of this neighborhood is socially reproduced to be different from Lincoln Park children, which is a white area. So before the labor market, the internal differentiation happens through processes of social reproduction. Finally, I already gave Bernard the answer that bored him to tears in his office. So I will simply repeat that for you. Why I consider prefiguration a provocation. It is because Marx is famously wary of giving you templates of the future, because he believes that future subjectivity, future behavior, future forms of affect will arise from the future itself through the specific kinds of struggle that births that future, right? So he believes that those emotions, those relationships will be shaped by the struggles from which they arise, which abolishes the law of value. So he's very, very reluctant to talk about templates. Like, this is what socialism will look like. Instead, he has a negative blueprints, if you like, where he says, this is what socialism will not look like. Okay, so he has some, again, you can scavenge from Marx some ideas of what he thinks socialism is through a negative lens of what it isn't. But there is also in Marx stray references which are not developed, damn him, but are very, very curious. For instance, in the Paris manuscripts, he talks about music as being unalienated expression of the human spirit. What? How can you possibly have unalienated expressions of the spirit in an alienated world? And this is where I would argue that Marx says that this piece we have to take with the other piece, which is it is in the seeds of this system that the future system is situated, right? So if that is the case, then it is possible within this system to glance or glimpse the glimmer of a future that could be, but not a blueprint. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, all three, for that. Kohei, you were interpolated, I think, in the last comments, and so I want to, I do want to open it up, and so I think maybe it would be a good time for you to jump in.
Okay, thank you. I'm Kohei. I have a question. I'm generally a very optimistic guy, but recently a little more pessimistic because we overshoot the 1.5 degrees Celsius last year, right? So a little bit pessimistic question. Maybe you give me some little more hope. And so like the whole point of writing about a manifesto is for the sake of emancipation, revolution, and then revolution is for emancipation. But the problem is, I think in today's situation, it's really hard to imagine that kind of emancipation in the future because the planet is degrading. And then what kind of emancipation can we have? And it seems that after the election of Trump, it doesn't seem like people are desiring that kind of emancipation either. I was hoping that the climate crisis will create some kind of universal conditions, like subjectivity, homogenization, a new revolutionary subjectivity. But what happened is people are just adapting. After the wildfire in Los Angeles, people will just go back and build new houses. So they're just adapting to the new environment. Even the, the externality or like outside that the TT talked about in the last section, I think it seems today's digitalization, we are fully subsumed under capital. Even our lab is created through data, like date matching application. And the lab is also created through digital. And democracy, people are voting for those authoritarian leaders. So I wonder, like, how do you see the possibility of emancipation, the whole point of writing manifesto? Where does it lie today?
Oh, boy, that's a tough one. All right. Go ahead.
Who wants to start?
Who's going to start?
Yes.
All right.
Am I still?
You're on?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Thank you.
obviously it's a very pressing question. I mean, sometimes I actually toy with the idea. I think about Walter Benjamin. Marx thought revolution was the locomotive of history, but maybe we should think of it as the emergency brake. This is not a utopian vision. This is, we're all going off the cliff unless we get our act together. But I do take the point that was raised earlier about where do people find, some hope or something that they could, a positive they can glimpse that is more than just pulling the emergency brake. And I guess I'm not sure if this is exactly what Tithi was getting at, but I think that it's in the lived contradiction between an aspiration and the thwarting in our, that I wouldn't point to a specific activity or a specific institution. I mean, we talked about Marx going back to the idea that maybe the Russian mir, the Russian commune, peasant commune could be the seed of socialism. Very dubious, although there are plenty of indigenous activists who have a similar idea. In fact, there's a very intelligent discussion of this problem in the ex-vice president of Bolivia. What's his first name? Garcia Linera. Indianismo and Marxism, a missed encounter between two revolutionary doctrines. Beautiful piece that I would recommend. So there is a lot of discussion. Social reproduction, does it give us glimpses of something? Well, all of us take pleasure in all kinds of things. And then we, see our pleasure, our hopes thwarted by the system. I recently started talking less about care work and more about domesticated labor, which is an analog to exploited labor or expropriated labor. It's about how the system deforms the labor, how it, cuts it up and divides it from other activities. And, so is there something in the contradiction? We want to abolish all those forms of labor, domesticated, exploited, expropriated. That doesn't mean we stop growing food or taking care of children, or, it's just that we liberate them so that there's something in there that if we feel it is being constrained or deformed. But I would put the emphasis on the deformation and how that is lived as a form of unhappiness.
All right, let me see first, maybe we open some conversations to others and interventions. Does anybody want to jump in at this point? Bruno, you ready? Yes. You want to pass that? Just come.
Hello, thank you. I was interested in what Cindy was speaking about with respect to the form of a manifesto, and in terms of the Communist Manifesto, of course, being this historical analysis of the epochs that came before, and the feminism for the 99% doesn't really go back that far. It looks at possibly the last 4 decades of neoliberalism and it starts with capitalism and doesn't really go into pre-societies or ideas of accumulation of surplus, family, sexual division of labor, where that came about, as most Marxist feminist texts do. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about whether that was a conscious decision, given what you said about, of course, the fatalities of the Communist Manifesto and where it went wrong in terms of using that historical analysis as sort of a lead to say, oh, this is going to be this automatic thing that's just going to happen. So was it that, or was it, I was just wondering if you could shed light on that.
I think it was, I speak at least for me, it was about really responding to when Marx and Engels write the Communist Manifesto, they need to provide a really comprehensive view, also historicized view of capitalism. So there are the various passages about capitalism, the bourgeoisie being the most revolutionary class, it has accomplished this and that, and so on. And also there is a reference to the colonization of the Americas as basically the prelude for capitalism. So they need to do this because they write at a moment in which so they need to reorient the Communist League away from a more religious understanding of communism And so they need to provide a really comprehensive view of capitalism in order to do this. So in other words, they need to provide an alternative theoretical approach that breaks also with the epistemological, let's say, foundations of the religious more millenarist approach to the question of communism in the Communist League. Now, what we had to do with the Feminists for the 99% manifesto was precisely to respond to our own conjuncture, to our own, and what was required was, on the one hand, to not simplify, but to explain the role of social reproduction within capitalism in accessible terms, so as to orient, let's say, the discussion. So we didn't need to go back to the debates about feminist debates about the origin of women's oppression or reconstructing this. The need was actually to try to reinforce the process of formation of this form of feminism that was rooted in class struggle, that was expressing itself in feminist strike, giving to this kind of movement, offering a comprehensive view of the present. So, in other words, what is the role of the feminist strike movements, given the role of social reproduction within capitalism, given the crisis of liberal feminism, and given also this bifurcation of possibilities that we were facing. Unfortunately, we went the wrong direction between, let's say, the rebuilding of a large working class movement internationally, or the further turn to the right, because this is also what we write in the manifesto. Like we write about the fact that basically the progressive neoliberalism of the Democratic Party is actually creating the conditions for Trump, and this happening the most egregious way and most visible way at the last election. But it was really like stunning. But the same can be said, in various countries where in fact, social democratic parties moved right and became neoliberal, and this basically opened the doors, created the conditions for return to the far right. So the manifesto was trying to respond to this specific conjuncture. So in other words, there was a crisis of the workers' movement and a dissolution of its organizations. There is now a feminist movement that actually is rooted in class struggle, breaking with the traditional liberal feminism, that is rethinking how to organize strikes and how to combine strikes in social reproduction and in production, and that is positioning itself at the forefront of a process of a possible rebuilding of class struggle. And this was necessary in order to avoid the turn to the far right, that is actually in which basically we are immersed today. I must say, I don't think we were, to go back to something Nancy was saying, I don't think we were too optimistic about the feminist strike movements. I mean, we couldn't predict the pandemic. I mean, honestly, like, maybe like, yes, like paying more attention to climate change, and we could have predicted this, but none of us was thinking about, a global pandemic hitting us. And actually, the global pandemic played a great role in basically slowing down and then stopping the feminist strike movement. Until 2020, the movement was growing and growing. So it did contain potentialities for further development and growth. It has spread to more countries. But then the pandemic made it impossible so to continue. Like this is the basic reason why. I mean, on the one hand, there was the health, the safety issue, like that you couldn't really like gather in large masses and so on, but also like in a sense the social and cultural change the pandemic created, which was not a change for the better. Unfortunately, it was actually the beginning, let's say, of a of a further turn right.
Although, yeah, we're going to go to Giselle in a second right here. Although summer of 2020 was a
Yes.
remarkable
Yeah.
uprising on,
Yeah, of
you know,
course.
movement for Black lives, which was
And the pandemic put a
amazing.
big spotlight on social reproduction.
Giselle Williams.
I feel like Cinzia actually addressed my question, which was really about the language of like the 99% versus the 1%, which I've been skeptical of in the past because it itself emerged out of a moment where there was an excess of optimism, you know, Occupy Wall Street, etc. But I also think on the flip side that it has been a really effective means of people being able to understand themselves within this particular historical conjuncture in this stage of capitalism. I think something that Tithi said was that, you know, if you could go to anywhere in the world and if you say 99%, like a person you speak that to will know what you're talking about. And I've been thinking, I guess, a lot about language and translating, I guess, in this current moment where it feels like we are at a very particular historical conjuncture where that bifurcation of possibility like has emerged like once again. Not that it ever disappeared, but for me, I think it's emerged in a way that's stronger and more visceral, at least in my lifetime. I mean, I'm only 21, but you know, at least in my lifetime. So I don't know. Is the language of the 99% like, I don't want to say, I don't think it's a good question to ask if it's still relevant, but is it something that we need to think more critically about translating, like how can we transition into this moment where people actually see the seeds of possibility in the system, but also in a way that they feel like they can affect in their lives? Maybe that's not a very incredibly provocative question, but I've been thinking a lot about like language and translating these messages of like how we transition to the next stage of the social formation. I don't know, something like that.
I just
Respond
want
to
to
that?
respond quickly to that. Thank you, Giselle. That's a very important question. I think at each historical moment when we have slogans that reflect or try to express the zeitgeist of the social movement from which it was born, it has a shelf life. So we can say bread, peace, and land, it will not affect you, nor will you understand the depth and thickness of that slogan. However, if I am to say free Palestine, you immediately know what the anchor is in the current time. It helps distill movements and it also helps cohere movements. So we want to understand these slogans, these formulations as being very specific to the moment that they were born from. Obviously, certain general principles in Marxism are also sound like slogans. For instance, the working class has no country, or the working class, the self-emancipation of the working class is the task of the working class. So there are all of these sort of Marxist principles that can sound like slogans, but they're actually not slogans, right? So, so that's something I think we have to be very, very conscious of as to which social moment and which social movement we are trying to write about or think about. And then we will understand, I want you to see social movement, so slogans like this as resonances, okay? They echo back the movement's aspirations in a limited form. So when you feel that resonance, if you're part of this movement, then you know that that slogan is suitable for that moment. So saying, 1% or 99% does not have that resonance right now that Free Palestine does. So again, from the streets of Delhi to, Qatar and everywhere, that slogan actually is a mobilizing slogan, just like BLM was in 2020, right? BLM was about a specific American case, but it helped topple statues all over the world. So I want us to understand 99% or the call for the 99% to be mobilized in that tone or in that frame.
Can I add a very brief point? This I admit is perverse. I can think of one context in which 99% and 1% could acquire a lot of resonance, and that is in what I am anticipating to be the huge conflict between the Musk wing of Trump and the Mexican rapist wing. No, seriously, I think that's where this is going to revive, not exactly in those words. The other thing I wanted to say very quickly is that I was with once in a discussion with Andreas Malm, and he said, what is our equivalent of peace, of bread, peace, and land, peace, and bread? Because that's not the same as the 99%. That's like laying out markers for, what is the most pressing thing we have to do. And the only thing I've heard that it all echoes it is woman, life, freedom. That's very powerful. It's maybe not, but that's, So I started thinking, well, what could our land, peace, and bread be? Planet, livelihood, I don't know, future, health, respect. I mean, it's not easy to come up with something like that, but we should all think about it.
I'm going to pass it to David Boss, who's got the mic right now, but just say a word, though, which is that in a way, as we think about the relationship between the mobilizing slogan, or which was the question of left populism in a way, the mobilizing slogan, and the different movements that have arisen from 2017, 18, feminist movements, Black Lives movements, 2020, Palestinian movements, more recently. I think that there's the question of the slogan and the mobilization around particular movements. There's also the underlying question of the kind of economic and some question of the way in which those slogans relate to, and the movements themselves relate to, the deeper economic analysis of what's going on that's triggering these different things, which of course some of the work that you do in this manifesto, but I think that that's really important for us to try and get straight at this point, right?
Another very quick thought. Land, peace, and bread is about constituting a counter-hegemonic bloc. It's saying peasants, workers, the poor, soldiers. So that's how you have to think. What are the pieces of your historic bloc? And it's about putting them in the same frame, right? So that's why I started with planet, livelihood, ecologists, workers, maybe care. I don't know. I don't like the word care, but people know what it means.
David Boss.
Thank you so much. There's something very special about the sort of text the manifestos, and you, Cinzia, you mentioned it. Yeah, there's something special about the sort of text the manifestos, and you, Cinzia, I love that you mentioned it. Like from a literary perspective, and arguably from a retrospective perspective as well. Every time I come back to the manifesto, It seems it kind of incorporates an ideal sort of script for contemporary narratives to turn over. So it might, I mean, this might be due to the fact that it convincingly tries to establish a historical account of the cultural circumstances of the time, right? It shows how things go about or did go about. And it sets what you would call in narratology the ordinariness. So, and yes, we know scripts kind of get established to cope with the social anomalies of yesterday. So what your manifesto, Lenin's thesis, also Professor Harcourt's take, have in common is that they kind of use this script as a backdrop to insert a new narrative, to, in short, breach with certain elements of the script. Lenin uses an action narrative, you a blind spot for diversity and social reproduction, and Professor Harcourt uses a historical counter-narrative, so to speak. The class downfall of the proletariat is no longer lived. So to stay in the waters of the rhetoric here, the main point is a question of persuasion, I feel. How to increase the involvement of a targeted audience while using some sort of kairos, let's say. Marx and Engels used the lived experience of the proletariat. Lenin tried to give a taste of what liberation could look like. You used the lived experience of the oppressed, and it seems like Professor Harcourt strives for an anthropological point of view, like something that Benedict Savoy called libido dominandi, this desire to dominate. So I think ultimately what my question boils down to is this main work of Marx the blueprint for a communist storytelling?
Blueprint. Yeah.
I wouldn't call it a blueprint, but I would say that yes, in the sense that it does. Perhaps the key word I would use maybe is not so much persuasion, but reorientation, maybe. So it's because it's about changing the way of looking at reality, changing the way in which one interprets the conditions of existence in which she's immersed. This entails also, opening up new ways of imagining things, and this is present in the Communist Manifesto, and there is also like this. In a sense, like there is this evocation of these powerful images about the revolutionary power of the bourgeoisie. We have seen like incredible things happening because of the bourgeoisie and so on. And I think the goal there is well, there is in a sense also some admiration, but the goal is to appropriate probably this. Demiurgic capacity of transforming the world for the working class, for the proletariat. So in other words, like this is, look at what the bourgeoisie has done, but the proletariat can actually do something more, even greater than this, much more important than this, and more just and so on. So I would say that, yeah. So probably like a good manifesto has to create a new, has to stimulate a new way of interpreting reality. So, and I must say, like, this is more of a biographical point. I read the manifesto for the first time when I was 15. At the time, I was pretty religious. I was Catholic. And then I read the Communist Manifesto, and this changed everything for me, like forever. Then it's like I never, actually, like I'm moving farther left. So this was really like, it was some kind of moment of revelation in which my whole understanding of the world completely changed all of a sudden. I said, oh my God, but this makes really sense. This speaks to also my experience of poverty. I was from a working class, poor family and so on. This really like, explains to me who I am and, you know, in what situation I am. And so ideally a manifesto, you know, a political manifesto should aim to have this kind of effect in the sense of, you know, hitting you in the head with a really very new way of thinking about reality. So a new narrative, as you said, and so on, and reorienting the way you thought about yourself and your relation to the world and so on.
That's very good. I like this exchange very much. And just to add one possible piece, I think empowerment, because it's not just look what the bourgeoisie did. Look what is attributed to the bourgeoisie that you actually did.
Yes.
And not only that, it's about expanding the frame by giving people a sense of how what they are doing fits into something much bigger historically and systematically. And that's about empowerment through knowledge. You're seeing yourself as an agent and as somebody who understands in a much broader way than you ever did before. I think that's very empowering.
That's interesting. Also, Cinzia, as a Catholic, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Add a tiny bit, which is a manifesto also, a successful manifesto also has to be a diagnostic. And only as a diagnostic can it hit you on the head, right? Because it can't just be polemical and rhetorical. That is not a manifesto that's going to stand the test of time. A manifesto has to show, this is why in Marxism, not just in Marx, but in Marxism, you will see Marxist theorists use the word appearance all the time, because the fundamental diagnostic is that the world as it appears is not true. That's the matrix. You have to look beyond it and see what the real mechanisms of this world are. So everything that you see is an appearance, right? So this is the, very simply put, obviously it's more than that, but that's why a good manifesto can diagnose the problem that it is addressing and therefore chart an aspirational path for the future, right? So this is why Lenin actually doesn't write a manifesto. Lenin actually does what he does. He writes organizing documents because he is in the middle of a ferment, right? So there is no space or even need to write aspirational manifestos. What he needed at the moment was organizational texts that would cohere and direct the movement that was already present. So that's kind of, I think, the difference between a manifesto and a polemic that claims to be a manifesto.
And yeah, I was just going to say that it would be, it's interesting also to think of the genealogy of the manifesto and the way in which it arose as originally as a catechism, right? Which would be particularly interesting for a Catholic, but how it was in its early forms as Engels was writing them, these credos in a way. And of course, all this makes me think, Kohei, of your manifesto as well, right? Which has got manifesto in the title, right? Of course, it's a thick manifesto. Okay, all right. Bruno was.
Yeah, I have basically, I mean, to go back to the question about the diagnostic and the 99%, I think Cynthia and Nancy sort of repeated that point that it's an interpellation, it's a slogan that is aspirational and it tries to mobilize rather than describe. You blamed, or in a sense, criticized the manifesto for being too optimistic in the description of what was systematically already happening and that it would necessarily lead to a certain revolutionary moment. But I think with the 99%, and I just don't want to go back to that only, but it also plays on that ambivalence that I'm not exactly convinced that you can say 99% in any context these days, whether it's Modi's India, Milei's Argentina or Trump's USA, I actually fear a little bit that I do not know what political end of the spectrum people come from when they're in favor of the 99%. And the weird situation we are in today is that there is even a popular majority in the US that is in favor of a fascist regime and that embraces both Elon Musk and the Steve Bannon side of the Trumpist right-wing populism. And in a sense, we also, in terms of the diagnostic, have to analyze better why is it that the right, in all these international contexts, has been able to create a historic bloc like Laclau would have dreamt of if we could even do a percentage of that on the left. Because all those struggles that people, the multiple struggles that you want to find alliances, articulations between, the right in their electoral platform was perfectly capable of throwing everything together so that drill, baby, drill, so climate, trans, LGBTQ, colonialism, history of slavery in this country, you name it, every right-wing agenda was thrown in and people, gobble it up. And so the interpolating power of that form of populism, I think we haven't really understood. And I think you're totally on, sort of that notion of the internally divided totality with the divisions within the 99%. In that sense, 99% is way too optimistic because it assumes, yeah, we know that people are misguided and maybe blinded by the appearances. If we can only teach them what the real contradictions are, they would come over to the socialist side. And this is simply not happening in a context today where we have rising fascism and authoritarianism that combines brilliantly, if you want, the creation of a hegemonic bloc that the left has zero answers for. And I think maybe it's related to the fact that the 99% was not talking about just a pure aspiration. There were also political strategies attached to it, which was mostly, it was not a manifesto for a party like Marxist was originally meant to be. Just like Lenin was arguing from a party form of organization. It was leaderless, it was horizontal, it was anti-party, and it was in general anti-institutional in terms of we do not want a new hierarchy of or reduplication of any form of hierarchical organization with leaders and followers. And if that's the case, I think the moment that we're in right now needs to be diagnosed not as a left versus right populism or a strong right populism that we need to answer with a left populism. We are in a generalized state of libertarianism where what is happening is the destruction of any institution that would keep up civil rights, nationwide policies about how to address climate or discrimination or colonial expansion and the continuing legacy of inter-imperial warfare. Any institution, the deep state, political parties, democratic institutions, universities, they're all being demolished by both the left and the right because what they share in common is a certain anti-institutional libertarianism. So I think we haven't really come to terms with that diagnostic of what is this new unity today of this new form of fascist, neo-fascist authoritarianism that we see pop up, and the scenarios are very simple, and they are winning democratic elections, left and right.
So to ask you back a question, if that is the case, then how do you explain global movements for Palestine? Because there must be a social movement theory that can explain why millions of people across the globe actually are willing to face bullets, expulsions, job losses, and a jeopardization of their lives.
Global movements, but rather what is the level of political articulation that they reach to address each and every one of those internal divisions within the totality? I mean, of course, here and in the, university environment where people know the history of settler colonialism, we can tie these things together. Formation of the nation state, beginning of capitalism, drenched in blood, colonial paradigms, based on racism, based on sexism, based on social reproduction, and labor exploitation. So we can connect those dots. But at the level of what you were talking about in terms of political articulation, not just describing, but how are you going to mobilize an alternative to it? We also are seeing that we are now in the midst of a ceasefire that is agreed upon by two fascist leaders. And, you know, this was what people were asking for the longest time. And there is a clear awareness on all levels of existing power of how to defang many of these global solidarity movements. And what will be the lasting effect? I am very pessimistic about that.
Go on.
I think that's
Nancy,
really,
and then go ahead.
I take this is a deep and really central question, and you formulated it beautifully. It's the sort of thing that keeps me up at night. And basically, what the strategy of our manifesto was, it was what Tithi said in part, diagnosis. We will show you how to connect the dots. And once you see that there's one system that's fucking up everybody's lives in different ways, then you can all come together and fight it. It's very intellectualist. It's very cognitive. And what underlies what right-wing populism has is somehow a kind of robust or hefty sense of the people. It's an identity that they have. They are the real Americans or the real Hindu Indians or whatever it is. They have some way of invoking the people. And then it doesn't matter how many disconnected things you throw into the pot. It's all about, you know, defending the people. And this is where, I mean, I'm going back to the working class. We need something to counterpose to the people. It's the old mass versus class problem in the history of socialism. So, I mean, I don't know if this can be rehabilitated today, but if we had a broader idea of what work is and what a worker is and why social reproduction is work, why it's not just the factory, but it's the family, it's the, you know, et cetera, the refugee camp. I don't know, but I'm very aware of how this is another sense of being too optimistic, that the cognitive, this is the classic liberal problem. If you just explain how it works, everyone will fall into line behind it. Forget it. So affect, identity, I don't know. I don't know how to do it. It's not my thing. Never has been, but I know we need it.
Thanks, Nancy. I think we really only have time for one more question. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. Hope, I think you're gonna have the last question, and then maybe we can have a last passage with our speakers. Go ahead, Hope.
It was off. Hi, I'm Hope. Thank you all for coming and speaking with us today. It's been a really great experience. So forgive me if my thoughts on this are a little bit disjointed, but I'm very curious as to your perspectives about where disability and disabled anti-capitalism fit into this work and fit into feminism for the 99% as well. I think throughout this evening, we've spoken a lot about the idea of a collective and different forms of collective. We've focused on the aspiration of a collective in the 99%. We've talked about the working class as a form of collective. And these collectives are spaces from which disabled people are often excluded, especially because we're not considered to be productive members of society, if we are even considered to be members of society at all. I see this a lot in leftist movements. I experience this a lot in leftist movements. It's the marginalization of disabled people within a movement that claims to be universal and claims to serve a collective. And you all also talked a lot about redefining ideas of work and what the worker is. You literally just said that in your response. And that was also something that you all touched upon when defining the social reproductive labor and reconceptions of work from a bunch of men in a factory to things that include broader senses of what work and labor is. So I'm very curious about where disabled resistance to capitalism figures in here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hope. So what I propose is maybe answering that and also wrapping up with some final, with any final thoughts.
Yeah.
Cinzia.
Very briefly, because I think we run out of time, but no, this is a great question. I think so we didn't. So the manifesto doesn't really address this issue, and it's a limitation of the manifesto. But in social reproduction theory, there are actually theorists doing the work in a rather interesting way. So one, for example, is Aaron Jaffe, who wrote a book on the socialist horizon and so on. He has a part also on disability, and he's also now publishing a paper on disability. And basically, it's trying to show how social reproduction theory can actually offer some diagnostic tools to understand the marginalization, oppression of disabled people within capitalism, and also how the very notion of disability is, in a sense, created by capitalism and the demands of capitalist production and productivity and so on and so on. So this may be an interesting reference point, let's say, to see how social reproduction could actually develop in such a way as to respond to these concerns. And then, in terms of collective participation, this is really the task of social, political or social organization movements to actually find ways, not to presume that everybody can participate in the same way, and to find, to diversify the ways in which one can participate and contribute, and to avoid, having organizational tools to avoid marginalization and so on. As a more general conclusion, because I think I'm guilty of having been too pessimistic in my remarks about the situation in which we are. So going back to Bruno, so I don't know how to, I don't have an answer, I don't have a solution right now. I wish I did, but I think none of us has it. We need some collective work to come up with some solutions and some ideas about how to get out of this situation. But what I can say is that, in 1914, the Russian socialists thought, as you know, that the situation was lost. It was a disaster. Russia was engaging in this imperialist war. Socialist organizations were, banned and disbanded. The Bolshevik Party basically disappeared, almost died, and so on. And then 3 years later, the February Revolution happens, and this, changes everything. And so Lenin was used to say, you cannot predict the moment in which the revolution will take place, or mobilizations will start, and so on. But what you can do is to be prepared for it. So just always be prepared, be ready, be prepared, and so on. And this means organizing. Not only writing, understanding, interpreting the situation, but also active collective organization, practical organization. There is no, and from this viewpoint, I agree with you. I mean, I personally, when I wrote the manifesto, I never thought that appealing to the to feminists for the 99% using this slogan meant that if only you I can teach you how to get together and explain to you why you should all get together, this will solve the issue. I mean, I have always been allergic to understanding politics as education, or the political organizing as education. Political struggles, actually, however, are educational. So in other words, this is what actually can change for the for large masses of people, can change the way of thinking. And, like nobody was predicting the Black Rebellion in 2020. And then it happened. So let's see. I mean, I wouldn't, I think I was a bit too negative earlier because, climate change and, AI and other problems. But I wouldn't go too far in terms of pessimism. I think there are a lot of, for example, in the United States, there are a lot of contradictions in the social bloc created by, social political bloc created by Trump. I don't exclude, Trump and Musk like falling out in a few months because, big egos and slightly different agendas. So let's see how the situation evolves. And in the meantime, let's get ready. So, let's, continue organizing.
So I'm almost afraid to not end on that positive note, but go ahead.
I don't think I can rise to that, but I guess I want to make maybe a quick remark about disability. I personally have learned so much from the literature, the disability studies literature, about the relativity of what we see as ability or disability to a background, to a context, to even the built environment, and so on and so forth. I think that's a very powerful lens for looking at lots of things. So it's a two-way street. It's not just what social reproduction theory can bring to that, but also what this way of changing this frame brings us for looking at other things. I guess two other quick points. On the present, I think this is an interregnum moment. I think that the Gramscian formulation is correct. I think it's a highly unstable, chaotic moment, and also a very dangerous moment. I think geopolitical turbulence, a war on many fronts is possible. Obviously, climate, but at the political level, there's going to be a lot of chaos. This is not going to sort itself out. Trumpism and its analogs elsewhere cannot solve the problems that drive people into those movements. It's true that Adam Tooze has proposed a scenario that there could be a form of hegemony that consists in repeated alternations of Bidenism and Trump, and neither one works. So we just go back and forth from one to the other and nothing else ever emerges. I'm not saying I can rule it out forever, but I'm betting on chaos, actually. And that leads to my second point. You cannot create motion. Social reality does that. People politicize, they radicalize, they fight. And maybe this, I'm not sure if it goes against what you were just saying, maybe not, but I always see myself as an intellectual, as someone who, I also have an activist hat, but frankly, it's much smaller than my professorial one. That's sort of who I am after all these decades in the university. I see the left as actually offering some kind of guidance to people who are already in motion. It's not going to create the motion. And it's Bruno is right that the right has done a much better job at that. If I wanted to make excuses about the US, I would say that it's pretty important that the Republican Party is much more democratic than the Democratic Party, which just completely, ruthlessly eliminates any alternative to a neoliberal. Whereas the Republican Party actually let Trump take over. They didn't like it, but they're enjoying it now, I guess.
Thanks.
So I will come back to you. And that article by Aaron Jaffe is in Spectre, so Journal Spectre. And it's a wonderful article. And he doesn't just talk about SRT, he talks about how disability is produced and maintained in capitalism and why it needs it, right? So why it needs that label and to label these people. I want to pick up on something else you said, which was the question of universal, that disabled people talk about the universal, and yet disabled people are not part of it. I study empire, and for my people, we were offered enlightenment as the universal, except in that universal, there was only Europe. And so for me, the universal is a very important category that the left work on, but I believe that the universal cannot be an a priori. The universal has to be built. So you cannot assume a commonality of purpose between you and I. We have to work together in an organizational and necessarily resistant space in order to build that commonality and that trust. So I cannot assume something is universal between you and I, or, in the larger sense. So a working universal, a practical universal that's rooted in the world, rather than an universal, which is an abstract concept of assumed commonality. Lastly, about the present, I don't think I fully agree with you, and that was probably apparent. I do think that the cohesion of the right is not as stable as it appears. I would go back to Perry Anderson's piece on Bolsonaro, when Bolsonaro was at the height of his power, and where Perry shows how the social roots of Bolsonaroism, or whatever it can be called, was extremely unstable and shallow. So he predicted that this was not going to be a movement that digs further in and creates fascist forms. The same could be said of Modi also, but Modi is a different case because Modi has a street organization that was formed in 1926 that no other right-wing populist leader right now has. So Modi has the RSS, which no one else has. So Modi's case is slightly different. But even in Modi's case, you should perhaps look at the farmers' movement a few years ago, which was a collective action by Indian farmers who drove their tractors into the streets of New Delhi and forced the government to withdraw the farm laws to further neoliberalize the economy. So even there, Modi could not stand against this. So I would like to emphasize for all of us that the right is horrific, the right is cohering, but the cohesion is an unstable one precisely because of the nature of inter-imperial rivalry and the climate crisis. And finally, I think I absolutely agree, would like to repeat Cinzia's words, that we absolutely cannot create a movement. The movement will come, however, because it is in the nature of capitalism that it creates contradictions and people aspire for liberation or emancipation. The movement will arise. We have to figure out whether we are prepared for it. And preparing for it means today we build infrastructures of protest that will continue beyond the waning of the movement, because these organizational forms will be the memory of the working class for when the wave comes next. Thank you.
All right. Good. I'm glad we ended on that note. Thank you, Tithi. Please join me in thanking our guests, Cinzia, Nancy, and Tithi. Special thanks to Ricardo Rambera for making this all possible, and Reno, thanks for all the AV work, and thank you all for being here. We will meet again next Wednesday for Mark 713 on class struggles in France and W.E.B. Du Bois with Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. And yeah, so see you next Wednesday. And now please join us for a drink across the street at Arts and Crafts, okay? So we can continue the conversation. All right? Okay, thanks.